Okay, today we're going to look into it's more than an economic theory, it's more than a political theory, it's a human theory of Marxism, a theory that purportedly, supposedly, according to Marx and Engels and other communists of the time, described the heart of the human condition throughout history. And we will call it Marxism/communism. Communism as envisioned by Marx in the 1800s, a theory of world without business owners and without workers. In this lesson, we'll give a very distilled and hopefully straightforward introduction to Marxism, and in later lessons, we might have a talk on what grand narratives of the 1800s are in general, and possibly an examination of key phrases from the Communist Manifesto. A side note before we start, this distillation comes a lot from the primary source, Communist Manifesto, and subsequent afterwards introductions written by either Marx, Engels, or Marx and Engels together. Okay, the vocabulary words we need for today are the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' 23-page pamphlet that outlined the ideas of communism in 1848. And what was communism? Basically, simply a world without business owners. And because there's no business owners, no one is a worker to a business owner. Grand narrative is a set way of looking at the world that makes all parts of the human experience connected, seeing the world in basically one way, through one lens, and saying that it connects all parts of the human experience. Okay, the term bourgeoisie, communists in the 1800s used bourgeoisie to mean business owners who hire workers. Business owners have wealth and businesses, and they hire workers. The proletariat is the working class that works for wages. And finally, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a term that means it's a short-term part of the communist revolution where workers will forcibly remove all aspects of the bourgeoisie business and property. So it's a short-term dictatorship of the workers that will remove all wealth and business. And then it goes away. So it's a short-term dictatorship. Okay, so before we get into details of how it works and theories behind the theory, and let's just do the overly simplified sentence that kind of is the absolute simplest way we can express Marxism. The problem with the world is that business owners have wealth and exploit the workers. Get rid of business owners and wealth, and then no one will be exploited, an exploited worker, and things will get better. The biggest problem, and the only problem, is that there's wealth and the wealthy exploit workers. Get rid of the wealth, get rid of the wealthy, and no one will be exploited, and all other problems in the world go away. That's Marxism boiled down to one sentence. So let's start looking at Marxism piece by piece by piece. And when I say Marxism, I mean communism of the 1800s. They were the same thing. The only reason we call it Marxism now is because the communism of the 1800s doesn't really look like the actual communist countries in the 1900s. So this is the original communism, which we now call Marxism. Okay, so the Marx came up also with the communists came up with, and Engels, but he's credited with putting it into these words. A grand narrative of Marx is that all history has been a history of class struggles, of struggles between exploited people and the ones doing the exploiting, between dominated social classes and the dominating classes. Okay? And in Marx's narrative, this oppressor versus oppressed relationship is entirely based upon wealth and ownership. The businesses and the wealthy are the ones that oppress the workers. Now, that is a narrative if you're looking at business. You might agree with it, you might not agree with it, but it seems to be focused on business because we're talking about workers and business owners and wealthy and non-wealthy, and you only get wealthy through business, etc., etc., etc. But what makes it a grand narrative is that the communists and Marx didn't say this applies only to business. They said the domination and the oppression of the worker is everywhere in everything. It is in the air. It is in the air you breathe. Nobody in history could exist without being part of that oppressed narrative based on wealth. So the wealthy exploiting the workers is seen in everything. Family, religion, nations, war. It's all made worse and all boils down to the wealthy oppressing the workers. Every system in a society throughout history, every system is set up to reinforce the power of the wealthy and to reinforce this oppression. Go to any part of life, according to a Marxist grand narrative. Any part of life. It's not if someone is getting oppressed and exploited by the wealthy. It's how is someone getting oppressed by the wealthy in every situation. It's not if, it's how. That's what makes a human grand narrative. Focusing in on one thing and saying it is everywhere and it affects everything. Okay, this, as a note, this is how they used to look at societies in the 1800s. Many people came up with a lot of grand narratives, like free market capitalism without government. Laissez-faire capitalism was great. The idea of social Darwinism is how things should be, and that means some cultures are superior to other cultures or better adapted. Grand narratives were very popular in the 1800s. However, there is great debate today as to whether grand narratives are true, useful, complete way of looking at societies. There are plenty of thinkers that say they are incomplete, and you can't boil human existence down to one aspect. You can't boil all of existence down to one thing, oppression based on wealth. So some people believe in grand narratives like they did in the 1800s. Others believe in multiple different ways of looking at societies through multiple different lenses. So let's look at the situation in 1848 Europe during the Industrial Revolution that would make communists and Karl Marx come up with that grand narrative for the existence of life. To be fair, this is right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And to be fair, in the course of human history, before and after, it is at basically the point in business and factories where workers were being worked the most. I mean, some reforms had happened, but you still had children age 10, as young as age 10, working up to 40 or 60 hours a week, adults working 60 to 70 hours a week. Life expectancy was still low, disease was still high. Things really were bad on many levels for the industrial worker. So, in that situation, 1848, according to the communists, the exploitation by the capitalist business owners, the bourgeoisie, was so bad during the Industrial Revolution that it corrupted every part of life of the worker. And they went farther to recognize that capitalism and the factory system was now spreading to every part of the world. And places that used to have old-style work without factories were now forced to buy factory goods. Remember, England, workshop of the world. Every country became united in a world that was being dominated by wealthy business owners exploiting workers. And so in the eyes of the communists, a complete tear down and rebuild of the system was needed. They couldn't tweak it. They had to tear it down and rebuild it without business, without accumulated wealth. That's what they thought was needed. And so Marx and Engels were part of a group, mostly them, that were asked to write the Communist Manifesto. Get all the ideas of communism, all the theories of why the capitalist system should be torn down and there should be a revolution. Write it down so everybody knows what the communists think. And then the communists, or the workers of the world, as they say, will unite and create a communist revolution. So that's in 1848 what I think he was 30 or 31, a young Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came to write the 23-page pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, which spells out the whole theory that wealth and business owners were bad, and when they went away, things would be better. In the pamphlet Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, one of the large portions of it, is talking about how communism was supposed to happen. Yes, they start off by talking about the grand narrative of exploitation. They talk about the situation in Europe in 1848 and how capitalism in their mind is out of control. And then they go on to say, okay, so how is it fixed? What's going to happen? This is what was supposed to happen according to Marx and Engels. There would be some sort of worker revolts. Proletariat is their word for the worker. Some sort of proletariat revolt. And the proletariat would take over the country. And they would establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. Literally an all-powerful government run by the workers. Now, the purpose of that all-powerful worker government is to force getting rid of accumulated wealth and business ownership, to get rid of anyone who has wealth over others and could possibly hire them. So to get rid of business owners so there can be no worker exploitation. So everybody is a producer and no one is a business owner. Now, a dictatorship of all-powerful people, even if they're workers, doesn't sound like a very happy world to live in. Why would you substitute a dictatorship of the rich for a dictatorship of any other kind? No. What Marx says is that this dictatorship of the proletariat is temporary. It's used only to get rid of the business owners and their wealth. And once the business owners and wealth are gone, economic classes are gone, and the political dictatorship will disappear. It not only has no purpose, it's not needed. As Marx and Engels say, when in the course of the development, the classes have disappeared and all the wealth and production has been concentrated in the association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Because politics is merely organized upper class power oppressing another. So once again, it's the grand narrative. Everything is all about the wealthy oppressing the workers. And if there is no more wealthy oppressing the workers, there's no government, because all government was a system to keep the oppression going. So government will go away. It's not needed. So Marx and Engels spend very little time in very little detail examining what society and what the world is supposed to look like once there are no wealthy people oppressing the vast majority of poor workers. A little note. These notes are not purposefully unclear or vague. We're not trying to make things shorter than they really are. The manifesto does not give detailed information as to what will happen, except there is an implication that everything will get better. Once again, it's the idea that everything bad in society will go away or get better once the wealthy aren't oppressing. And anything you could think of that was good before will get more good. And because the oppression-oppressed narrative was a grand narrative, every part of humanity changes. Family structure will change. It's implied that there's less need for the family, but it's not very specific. Women and children's lives will increase, mentioning the words community of women and less child labor. More education for children was mentioned. Nations will end the hostilities between each other because of reasons, and nations might even dissolve because nations realize that they're all made up of workers and all workers are the same, and they unite, and then they create a non-oppressed society because they did the communist revolution. So nations might even dissolve, and it will just be one humanity together. Traditional ideas will change with the implication that they might go away, but at the very least, the manifesto says that the new world will change these. Ideas of freedom, justice, religion, morality, implying that once there isn't any wealthy oppressors, even the ideas of freedom, justice, religion, morality, we might not even think of them in the same way, whether they'll even be here after the revolution. The manifesto doesn't talk at all about crime and what happens to crime in the new society. Obviously, we can assume that they would say, and they probably wrote about it in other places, that no crime based on money would happen because wealth is not a factor. But what about crimes based upon emotions? There are many crimes, severe crimes based not at all about money, but based upon emotions. So what happens about those? How does society take care of that? And a question they don't address whatsoever, which you might be thinking, once everyone is happy because there's no economic oppression, what stops people from trying to get rich again? Obviously, people are happy because life is perfect because there's no economic oppression, but what's to stop people from saying, hey, wait a minute, life's pretty good, but could it be even better if I had some more stuff? And so what's to prevent people from trying to get more stuff or do less work, and then all of a sudden you have the capitalist system again? Not addressed. So no communist revolution happened for 70 years. Okay? No communist revolution happened in the 1800s. A simple way to think about it is that the workers' conditions kept getting better and better and better. And I mean, a communist revolution and the communist theory of life is really scary because it's so radical. It's tearing down an established system that's been established since the dawn of cities and replacing it with something entirely different. So it was scary to a lot of people. And in fact, out of all the political parties in the 1800s, the communists were the most feared and spoken down by all other parties. So it never happened in the 1800s. The workers' lives just got better and better, and nowhere's near the lives that workers live today in developed countries. But enough that the appeal of a very scary revolution in an unknown world afterwards, no one wanted to go there. It wasn't until 1917, long after Marx and Engels have both died, that the first communist revolution actually took place, and it took place in Russia. And one of the reasons it took place in Russia, it was smack dab in the middle of the worst war, World War I, the worst war Russia had ever been in. The despair and the pain the people were facing at the time was unbelievable. And there were some serious communist leaders to lead that revolution. And so it happened. And then all the other communist revolutions happened because of the inspiration that the Russian communist revolution did. So it never happened when Marx and Engels thought it would, and it never happened because of the reasons Marx and Engels thought it would. It happened for reasons in the 19th or the 20th century, the 1900s. So let's give a very cursory, very shallow overview of the communism as it's in practice in the 1900s. Now, some of the most famous countries that became communist, that all went through bloody communist revolutions. Well, Marx was predictable on that. He was right on that. In order to seize the wealth of the bourgeoisie and create a new dictatorship of the proletariat, it's going to be a bloody revolution. Number one, people don't want to lose their established way of life and politics. And number two, people with any kind of wealth don't want to lose their wealth. And it turns out that people will fight to the death just to try to protect their way of life and what little money they might have in the face of a communist revolution. So they were all bloody revolutions. It happened first in Russia, turning into the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, not in chronological order, and Cuba. Other nations did go communist too. These were some of the most famous with revolutions. So, in all these communist countries, was there a dictatorship of the workers where the business owners' wealth was gotten rid of and businesses were taken over by the state for the good of all? Yes. But did the dictatorship disappear? Did the public power government lose its political character and disappear? No. Every communist revolution got stuck at the dictatorship stage. The people who were in power after the revolution stayed in power as a communist party in Russia, the Communist Party in China, as a ruling family, the Kims in North Korea, or the Castros in Cuba. They stayed as a ruling family. Never did Marx's idea of government going away and society being an association for the free development of all. Never did the classes go away and everyone just exist as a free association. No, every communist revolution got stuck as a dictatorship, and there were still classes. The people who lived in the cities, the Communist Party, the military, they were all higher class than the farmers. There were still classes. There was still some sort of class oppression. It never dissolved into a beautiful world that Marx predicted. So what did we get with these countries? Well, it turns out that centrally planned economies where the government, where the communists make the choices, are pretty inefficient. Capitalism, for all its faults, fulfills people's wants and is very efficient at getting things done from a production business standpoint. So all these centrally planned countries were very inefficient, and people knew that because there were capitalist countries in the rest of the world, and the people were living with less of a standard of living in communist countries. And it turns out, in order to take the economy away from people, you have to restrict their natural rights. So in all of the communist dictatorship countries, there's varying degrees of people's natural rights and freedoms being restricted. And in a large amount of citizens did not like that in general. In the end, every communist country either abandoned the ideas of Marxist communism or changed it into their own style. Or some of the communist countries just totally rejected anything called communism and went to democracy. None of them exist how Marx wrote about it. And so the communist countries today are not Marxist countries. Marxism didn't work. No one could make it work. So the best these communist countries did, the ones that are still communist, is come up with something that kind of works for their own country. And I think something that Marx did not foresee. And to be fair, I don't know if he could have foreseen this, because the 1900s was when this really happened, when humanity was laid bare, and we could see as a world just how capable humans were of murdering millions and millions and millions of other humans. It would have probably blown, I'm just guessing, it probably would have blown Marx's mind if you had told him that a communist revolution would end in the death of millions, celebrated the death of millions in various countries. It just wasn't something that people were aware of that humans were capable of until the most horrible 100 years of human history, the 1900s, when it comes to mass murder. So this is probably of the ultimate importance. Communism as practiced in the 1900s. By living the life, and it wasn't just communism, but for this we're talking communism, but it wasn't just communism. Humans living the narrative of oppressor versus oppressed. By framing society as oppressor versus oppressed, it led to violence. And it didn't just lead to violence. It led, when the oppressed got power, it led to the mass murder of oppressors, seen most horribly from the communist side in Cambodia, where when the oppressed gained control, 1/3 of the country was murdered. Educated Cambodians, wealthy Cambodians, business-owning Cambodians, anyone who could have been considered an oppressor to the newly freed communist government, 1/3 of the population was murdered. And it's beyond the scope of this lesson, but we see this in the 1900s, and it doesn't have to be with communistic wealth oppression. Whenever we see the narrative of oppressor oppressing the oppressed, and and everything in society is framed, and that is the most important framing again and again and again. If things get out of hand, the violence that is unleashed is unbelievable. And it's one of the biggest lessons of the 1900s. And it's not every time it goes horribly, horribly wrong, but it's enough that we learn a lesson to watch out for it. Okay, so that is an overview of the Marxist theory, a world without business owners exploiting workers, right in the middle of the 1800s. All right, so thanks for watching.